In the closing chapter, we've been dealing with prorations between the buyer and seller. There's another function that's kind of closely associated with prorations, but it's technically not a proration because it only affects the buyer. And it's the concept of interim interest. Now think about interest. When a buyer is buying a property, borrowing money, the first example we're going to see here in just a moment is closing on June 18th. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it before, but if someone closes on June 18th, their first mortgage payment is not set for July 1st. It's actually set for August 1st. When they make the August 1st payment, they pay the interest that has accrued in July. Where if you're listening closely to that timeline, there's a gap between June 18th and July 1st where they have not paid any interest. That's what we refer to as the interim interest. Now, I don't know how well you know banks, but clearly banks are going to collect for every day that you have their money. It's just that they collect the interim interest at closing. So as we're calculating interim interest, let me remind you of a formula that you learned earlier in the year. Annualized interest equals principal times rate. Now, earlier in the year, when we were trying to figure out how much you owed after paying a monthly mortgage payment, how much of it went to principal and how much of it went to interest, we used this formula, and we were trying to find out how much interest was paid in a month. Well, when we're trying to solve for interim interest, we need to find out how much interest is paid in a given day. So if principal times rate equals annual interest, and there are 360 days in a year, then we're going to divide it by 360 to determine how much our daily interest, and then watch what we do with that. Okay, so I'm going to read you the problem. This is actually on page 53 in your workbook, and let's see if we can get to what we need to know. Jane is purchasing a property for $425,000 with a conventional loan with 10% down. The interest rate is 4.25% with a factor of 4.92. What is the interim interest charge if the closing date is June 18th when interest is paid in arrears? Actually a complicated question here because we gave you more information than what you need. First of all, notice that she's purchasing the house for $425,000. That's the purchase price. Notice that the purchase price is none of these. We need what her loan principal is. We don't need what the purchase price is. So the next line tells you that she's getting a conventional loan with 10% down. So her loan amount is going to be 90%. If she's putting 10% down, then her loan amount is 90%. So let's see what her actual loan amount will be. 425 times 0.9 is $382,500. $382,500. That is her principal. That's how much she's actually borrowing at the beginning of this loan. I continue reading. The interest rate is 4.25% with a factor of 4.92. Well, notice what the problem asks us for, what the formula asks us for. It asks us for rate. It asks us for interest rate. So her rate is 4.25%. As it turns out, that factor is unimportant in this question. So 382.5 times 0.0425 is going to tell me that in this year, her annualized interest would be $16,256.25. But when we're solving an interim interest question, we actually need to know what the daily interest is. So we're going to divide that number by 360. Divide it by 360, and you will find out her daily interest is $45 and roughly 15. I'm going to carry it out one more digit because the next digit is a 6. So for rounding issues, that might be an issue. So here's the deal. Her interest is accruing at $45.15, just over 15 cents per day. And now when we look at the number of days of interim interest, remember, interim interest is the time at the end of the month. But I got to tell you, with interim interest, there's one trick here. The way you calculate interim interest, and if you'll do it this way every time, you won't miss it. People who try to skip this process sometimes end up making a mistake by a day. And I've told you that rounding would not be an issue, but if you're off by $45, if you're off by one day, that will almost certainly be an issue on the exam. So when you're calculating the interim interest, you take the number of days in a month, which is always 30, okay? You subtract the closing date, which is June 18th, okay? And then you add the date of closing. So 30 minus 18 is 12, plus 1 is 13. Now, why did I add in the day of closing? think about it. The lender wants to get paid for every day that you own the property. Typically, the seller pays for the day of closing, but the seller has nothing to do with the buyer's new loan. So somebody has to pay that interest to the bank. And so the buyer does that. So 30 minus the day of closing, which is the 18th in your problem in your workbook, plus the day of closing, plus 1, equals 13 days. And so the interim interest on this problem right here is going to be, let's see, times 13, $587.03. Okay, and that is completely a debit to the buyer. Why a debit to the buyer? Well, the fact of the matter is, the seller had absolutely nothing to do with interim interest. So the buyer is going to be solely responsible for that. And then keep in mind what's going to happen when her next payment comes around in August. That will pay July's interest, and this covered the part at the end of the month of June. Interim interest, absolutely testable for the state and national exam.